Hello, and welcome to this lesson on scope documentation. Although our primary focus will be on the documentation or communicative aspects of scope, it's important to understand that that can intersect with the substance of the topic itself. And so, in that sense, we will be addressing aspects of both. So, one thing to understand about scope and other steps of the product development process is how much the terminology can vary, including even the terminology about these major steps themselves. So, for example, in CS and software engineering contexts, it's somewhat more common to actually separate out a scope step before even proceeding to a requirements phase. I had experienced that from a client's point of view when we needed to contract with software developers, whereas previously I was more familiar with situations where it's either dealt with as part of the requirements phase and or separated out as project management. And that ties in with another point I want to make about scope, which is that it has elements which deal more with the project as opposed to the product, such as managing the schedule and the resources. And it also has elements that deal more with the product and what it will do and be, although not nearly to the level of detail that the design requirements phase will get into. That brings up a point about what's often called the iron triangle of project management, which says fast, cheap, or good, pick any two. And it's just kind of an oversimplified way of pointing out that those three broad goals are often in some tension with each other. And a related point is this idea of scope creep, because the bottom line about scope is that it's about determining what's in and what's out, having clear boundaries about what the project exists to do. And if those aren't clear boundaries, then people can find that the scope gradually increases to cover things that are beyond what the agreed upon budget and schedule allow for. So it's very important that we make sure we have a sort of unified vision of the project and product aspects of what we're trying to do. Another related point about scope is that many aspects of it can overlap with or be found in various sorts of proposals. And when dealing with an external party, an external client, a scope document or some variation of it, such as a statement of work, can actually become part of a binding contract, which really highlights the point I was making about making sure that we avoid scope creep and that we make sure the product aspects of our scope are consistent with the project aspects of our scope. There are many, many ways that the product development process has been or could be described, broken down, graphically depicted. This happens to be one that has always been preferred by a colleague of mine who has a lot of experience with software development because she always liked how this separates out the distinct phases of scope, requirements, and specifications. Her experience was mainly with the waterfall methodology, where she would often have to prepare each of these deliverables in turn. Okay, now, for the rest of this lesson, we'll basically be going through the typical components of a scope document. Now, it's important to understand that there's a lot of variation on these, how they're organized and how comprehensive they are. This one's a bit more on the comprehensive side of the range, but that's good because it's easier to adapt to a less formal version than vice versa. So the first part is the project overview. And then within that, there are several elements. The first of which is typically the project name. And it's tempting to gloss over this or just give it some generic, clunky, descriptive name. But you'd be surprised how helpful it can be to come up with some kind of succinct, catchy name, even if it's just a tentative working starting point that's subject to change. It can really make a difference. The scope statement is often an important part that kind of encapsulates what the overall scope is, sort of an abstract of the scope itself. And sometimes this comes right away, sometimes it comes later on if some more context is needed to properly understand it. Uh, there's some amount of project background that's typically needed. The problem and solution are dealt with in some way. Sometimes they're blended, sometimes they're broken out separately, sometimes different aspects of your solution and approach are broken out separately. So there's a lot of flexibility on those details. Typically, at the end of this, though, you have a definition of success, or sometimes called measure of success. And this is really key. I mentioned earlier how sometimes a scope document or a variation of it can actually become part of a binding contract, particularly if there's an external client. And in those cases, the MOS or definition of success section will often be the key focal point if there's any dispute about whether or not the contract was satisfied. So it's particularly important to make sure that that part is as clear as possible. But I want to go back and zoom in on the scope statement a little bit more because that's a pretty critical piece of this. So let's look at an example for a scope statement and see what sorts of issues it may raise. Here's one. The university wants to upgrade its facilities to offer better Wi-Fi technologies accessible anywhere on campus. This project will offer students, faculty, and staff the ability to be productive from anywhere on campus. The project will take place over a time period in which measurable results will be achieved. Okay, this has several issues, right? Facilities, well, what facilities? The warehouse, the dorms. Are there some that are higher priority than others? Better Wi-Fi. Well, what level of Wi-Fi? What specification? The uh, the fact that it says the ability to be productive. Well, you can be productive without Wi-Fi, so that's very vague. A time period. Okay, that's really saying nothing. I mean, everything takes place over a time period, right? And measurable results. So that may have the hint of sounding concrete, but if you think about it, it's actually not committing to anything because almost anything could be measured in some way. So we really have a lot of room to be much more concrete and specific here. There's this acronym called SMART, which might be able to help us out. It stands for specific, measurable, agreed upon, realistic, and time bound. And I should mention there are a few variations of this floating around where sometimes the A stands for achievable, sometimes the R stands for relevant. Those specifics don't really matter. They're all good. They all help you have a convenient way to kind of check yourself and think of some ways to improve a goal or scope statement. Let's see how we might be able to improve that example by applying some of these. The university will upgrade the library, dormitories, offices, and then all campus buildings to IEEE 802.11 AC technology, starting with its largest libraries. This project will provide more convenient wireless network access for faculty, staff, and students. As outlined in the campus initiatives plan, the project will be complete before the start of fall semester such and such. Okay, well, as we can see, we were able to apply some of the SMART principles to make several improvements. So instead of saying facilities, we're identifying the facilities and even the sequence of priority, right? We're eventually going to get to all campus buildings, but we're prioritizing a few first. We specified the level of Wi-Fi technology. I'm not sure how old this example is and whether that is outdated yet or not. But the point is, it's there. Uh, so it also refers to wireless network access, which is a more clear articulation of the type of productivity or the way we're going to enhance productivity. I mean, it does say more convenient, which is a bit vague, but overall, this is much improved. We also cite some authority for why this is uh, uh, the right path when referring to the campus initiatives plan to indicate there's some agreement that this is that we're on the right track or that we're pursuing the right goals here, and then we have a actual time frame, a specific year and semester. So also, I'll say faculty, staff, and students is good, but it does leave somebody out, namely visitors or guests. That also raises an issue of stakeholders, which we'll be getting to in a moment. But overall, this is much improved. Okay, this is another example of a potential scope overview. This is a fairly brief one, and it's actually missing the project background component, but it's a reasonable example to give you another sense of how you might approach something like this. Okay, so after the overview piece and all its respective components, you then move on to the major sections of such a report. And one of the first, if not the first, section of a scope document in the main body is going to be about the stakeholders, some kind of stakeholder analysis. A stakeholder can be anyone who is directly involved in a project or affected by it or able to affect it. And that is a huge universe of potential people, right? Or organizations. It doesn't mean that all those people have to be described in detail in your report. It means that when you sit down to do this section, you need to have that conversation, brainstorm the full range of people that it could potentially include, and then make a conscious decision which ones to address in your document and to what extent. So consider that you may have more complete, comprehensive stakeholder profiles or analyses for some subsets of your stakeholders than others. Some you may choose not to address, but the point is really try to consider the full range. Here's a list of some things that a profile might include. It's also important to realize that there are some stakeholders that just readily pop into your mind when you sit down to think about it. A lot of times people think of the people that their immediate colleagues, the people they work with regularly. They think of a lot of times the end user because that's often an ingrained part of the development process. Talking to your customer or your end user. And then sometimes close collaborators are folks that you'll think of. But there are a lot of people beyond that that can sometimes be easy to miss. Several of them are listed here. I won't go through all of them. I just want to kind of point out a couple. Sometimes the customer is not the user, and so by customer in that case, I mean decision maker, the purchaser. And so when it's not the type of product that's actually purchased by the end user, you need to separately consider the purchaser. Another person or party or group of people that you often might not be inclined to think of, and yet do need to be considered, our competitors? How might they respond to what you're doing? And how might that in turn affect your approach? Again, doesn't mean they all have to be detailed. It just means you need to consider whether to address it. In the process of pre-writing that stakeholder analysis where you're kind of brainstorming who to address and in what ways and to what extent, it's often useful to think of all the stakeholders on a two-dimensional axis with their level of influence on one axis and their level of interest on the other. Because part of good project management is also thinking about the level and sorts of communication that you're going to have with these various with certain stakeholders throughout the project lifecycle. So, for example, people who have a lot of influence, a lot of power over your project, but very little interest because they're kind of far removed, need to be dealt with quite a bit of care because you're not going to have a lot of lengthy communications that they're going to read or listen to, but you need to put a lot of care and attention into making sure that your interactions that you do have with them are as effective as possible. Another important section of a scope document typically relates to the deliverables. And this can include deliverables about the product itself, uh, such as not only the final product, but incremental versions or milestone versions of the product, such as alpha and beta. And it can also include deliverables about uh, the, pro- the development process of the project. And these can include things like progress reports, presentations, even a scope document, not to be too meta about this. Another major section deals with resources. And resources, people often think budget, and that's very important. Money often has to be spent, but you also have to consider personnel. So, which members of your team are going to be allocating how much time to this and for over what duration. Also, you need to consider physical resources like lab space or equipment, licenses, whatever may be needed to accomplish the project. Another section deals with project management, and this includes sometimes this includes the resource section when the resource section isn't dealt with separately. But in addition to that, it can include management of the schedule and management of personnel and their respective tasks so as to ensure that all the deliverables we talked about a moment ago, whatever they may be, actually get met. And again, that can include milestone deliverables, whether technical or communicative, and final deliverables, whether technical or communicative. Also, on that point, these are typical considerations that we often need to make sure get addressed as part of a project management section. So, we need to make sure that we sync up any milestone deliverables with the schedule, make sure that they're consistent and realistic. We need to make sure that we've described any issues of how personnel are going to be managed, perhaps an org chart, perhaps percentages of effort over a certain period of time, depending on what is appropriate for a given case or how a given organization is run or what a given contract may call for. This can vary a lot. But those are typical things that would be addressed in some way. A very useful tool in organizing your work plan is the Gantt chart. A Gantt chart is a horizontal bar chart that shows what you're working on and when. And it helps you at a glance to see at least the major interdependencies so that you can see when one task needs to finish so that another task can begin. It also helps you see overlap so that you can think through what is realistic to do in parallel. What and you can sync that up with your allocation of personnel and other resources. So it's a useful tool. It has limits when you try to get too granular. It doesn't tend to lend itself to that, but that's often okay at the scope level because you're often punting on a lot of the more granular decisions about uh, certain when certain detailed subtasks will be finished. So this at a glance can help you at least plan out the big picture. There is also software such as Microsoft Project, which is very helpful for endeavoring to uh, make a more detailed Gantt chart where you actually can teach it the interdependencies so that if one task gets delayed, you can calculate the ripple effect instantly as to the impact that that may have on others. Um, I would say that if you're going to try to have a more detailed Gantt chart, it's best to use software like that so that you don't have to manually go through and rethink all of the interdependencies case by case as things change. You need to view it more as a living document, which I'll mention when we get to change control, but sometimes, depending on the agreement and the level of detail you attempt to have at the scope level, it may very well be viewed as a living document that has to be revisited at times. Oftentimes, a scope document has a section to deal with what could go wrong. Uh, in some cases, this may just focus on what could go wrong with the product, such as, what might cause this application to crash unexpectedly. And in other cases, it could also entertain what could go wrong on a project level, such as the cost of something rising unexpectedly and throwing off your budgetary plans. So uh, it's important to brainstorm as well as you reasonably can upfront what sort of foreseeable risks there may be, with the understanding that uh, a lot of the risks, particularly on the product side, can't fully be understood until you get further along in the design process. So often there's an understanding that this will need to be revisited in a subsequent deliverable, but you at least get it started. There are various approaches to how this might be described in a given document. One example could be a table such as this. And you'll note here we have some data security risks, for example. And I also just want to point out that as you see there, we have a recommended controls column, which highlights that risk analysis is not just about identifying the risks, but also, insofar as possible, also identifying how those risks might be addressed. The final aspect of scope documents that I want to address is this idea of needing some way to track its changes, its revisions. I mentioned that sometimes a scope document can be a living document. And so in those cases, it's very important to have a way of keeping track of exactly what is changing and when and by whom. I also mentioned that in the case of an external client, it can sometimes be a binding document. It can be part of a contract. And those things are not necessarily mutually exclusive, although hopefully the agreement is clear what sorts of events would trigger the need to revisit the document and who would be responsible for what in the event that that happens. But in any case, we need a clear, detailed way of tracking revisions. And here is just a very simple example of how a table might be structured to track that using some very old dates for some reason. And the last thing I'll leave you with is some concluding points. Defining a clear scope early in the project lifecycle is so critical. Hopefully, various aspects of this lesson really made it clear why this has to be done early on to maximize the efficiency of subsequent steps in the product development cycle and life cycle. Uh, as I said at the very beginning, at a high level, the bottom line about scope is what's in and what's out. And then the requirements phase will get into more detail about what the actual product being designed will do and be. As I was just explaining, even though they can be binding, they can also be changed. I just was talking about that a moment ago, so I won't rehash that. And I started out mentioning this issue of scope creep and how we have to be very careful to make sure that the resources and the time and the substance of what we're actually trying to accomplish are all coordinated, and that we sort of carefully monitor to make sure that we're not letting the boundaries of what we're trying to accomplish creep beyond what our agreed upon budget and time reasonably allow for. This is kind of a silly cartoon that helps make that point, and it kind of shows that even with good intentions, you think, hey, good client service, you want to maybe exceed expectations. Those are wonderful sentiments, and it's not that there's no room to do that. It's just that we have to be very careful not to do that to a point where it's going to raise problems for us. The term often used for that is gold plating. And the PMI Project Management Institute defines gold plating as giving the customer something they didn't ask for, not part of the project, something the client might not even want, maybe even beyond what's practical and reasonable for the effort. So just kind of keep in mind that balance. All right, well, this concludes the lesson on scope documentation. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.